My parents, especially my mother, have always been very attached to the land. They couldn't live in cramped apartments, they were always drawn to the countryside. But eventually circumstances forced them back to the city, and the first thing they did was to buy a house with a plot. The place was just a magnificent village on the bank of the river. The house was old and a bit run down, and the garden was neglected and overgrown, which scared me a bit at first. But knowing my parents' aptitude in agriculture, I soon calmed down. And indeed, in a couple of years the house was transformed and the garden became well-groomed and colorful. There was an old small stove in the house, so small that it could not heat all the rooms. So my parents only used it in the summer. And about 10 years ago, almost immediately after buying the house, they heard voices coming from behind the stove. At first, they thought the voices were coming from the street and didn't pay attention. But the next day it happened again. The parents went outside and there was no one there. They returned to the house and there was someone talking behind the stove. My mother, Elizabeth Marie, is a sociable woman who immediately made a lot of friends in the village. The voices were unfamiliar. 2 men and a woman were speaking. The words were indistinct, but they seemed to be having a conversation. My parents heard them every day since then. Only twice did something strange happen. The first time the voices seemed to be arguing, and the second time another female voice joined them. The rest of the time there were only 2 voices talking peacefully. My parents always believed in mysticism. My dad, John, was into alien stories and theories about parallel worlds. So they took the voices behind the stove as normal. After all, someone had lived in this old house before them, and now it seemed their souls were still here. One day it occurred to them that it could all be an illusion. But they decided to check it out. They called a neighbor. The poor woman was so frightened that she is still avoiding the house, although her parents tried to prepare her and told her what was going on, explaining that they wanted to see if they were not the only ones hearing voices. She confirmed that she heard voices too. The voices seemed to be coming from under the floor and the walls at the same time. But the house didn't have a basement. They were coming from somewhere around the corner of the house, from under the ground. After a while, the voices stopped. I asked my mom, who owned the house before, if it was connected to some tragic story. But Mom didn't know anything. They found the house through an ad, came to look at it and bought it. They still live there every summer, but they don't hear the voices anymore.